Hi, my name is Aria, and I'm going to be talking about services provided to inmates that are blind and visually impaired in jails and prisons. And this is more of a brief overview. So, if you would like more specific details, especially about the policies, definitely click in the description link of the YouTube video, and I will have a link to my paper if you want more details. So let's first start talking about the statistics. So as you can see, the prevalence of disabilities among jail inmates and the general population in 2011 to 2012. This was from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and for jail inmates, vision is 7.3%. And then for the prison population, it is 7.1%. And in Canada, the statistics were a little more difficult to find, and they're not as updated. This is from 2006. Out of 80 people that were asked, 21 reported having a visual disability. So in terms of policy, there's a lot more detail in the paper about policy, but this is just an example. And this seems to be sort of an overall trend that individualized determinations of needed accommodation should be made. So this is for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And they also define visual disabilities. They have numeric indications for what classifies as normal, low vision, and blindness. And for Correctional Service Canada, this is one example. And this is saying that the staff are aware of and make use of available community resources required to assist in maintaining effective communications with offenders with sensory disabilities. So in terms of employment, here is an example of employment. So just note that the AER Orientation and Mobility Division 9 does include correctional facilities under the scope of practice for O&M instructors. And then this is a job ad below. It's a screenshot talking about how they're looking for a certified orientation and mobility specialist to work at the Wakula Correctional Institution as well as the Columbia Correctional Institution. And the job description states to educate incarcerated clients/patients with visual impairments the skills needed for safety and independent living in a prison setting. So, what services and accommodations are there for inmates with visual impairments? So, the paper goes into more depth, but here are just some examples. There might be O&M, personal guides, house arrest instead of standard incarceration, sunglasses, talking books, assistive devices, or being in a special unit, and I will go into detail of each one. And an overall trend is that it seems to be a very case-by-case basis. It's important to remember that people have diverse eye conditions and diverse incarceration situations. It's not always one size fits all. So let's first talk about the O&M instruction. I did an interview with a prior professor of mine. She taught orientation and mobility training courses at the undergraduate level, and she discussed how the first time she worked in a prison, it was to provide information about eye health and the importance of eye care to inmates. She encouraged them to have appropriate hygiene, such as washing eye makeup off, washing their hands before touching their face and eyes. And then she worked at a prison again, and this time she taught O&M to a woman that lost her vision while incarcerated. And she had a cane, but she could not have a folding cane. The elastic was a suicide risk, and the O&M instruction was about how to get around the cell, the hallways, the cafeteria, the library, and the visiting areas. There always was a guard with them at all times, and she was not allowed to teach Braille because they said the stylus was too small and could have been a weapon. So instead they used talking books. So now let's talk about personal guides. And a lot of this information had to be collected through interviews and news articles due to the lack of information about this topic. So this was collected from a news article. And this is just an example of having a personal guide in prison. It's talking about how legally blind Bill Cosby has a personal guide in prison, is making friends with the respectful staff, and often chats with his wife. So that's the title of the article. So now let's talk about house arrest instead of standard incarceration. And again, this one is from a news article because, again, due to the lack of information. And this is talking about how a blind sex offender skips jail. The corrections could not accommodate blind prisoners. And that is the title of the news article. So now we'll talk about sunglasses. And I did a phone interview with an inmate in Salt Lake County Metro Jail. And he talked about a fellow inmate that was at the jail prior. I unfortunately was not able to interview that inmate specifically. But he said, I don't know what his condition was, but I know that he was blind. He could move around pretty well. He always had shades on. And I also saw YouTube video interviews of incarcerated inmates that are blind, and it showed them wearing sunglasses. So now let's talk about talking books, assistive devices, and being at a special unit. So the National Federation of the Blind, this is the source for this information, and the website was talking about an experience of an inmate that is blind. And since this is actually the oldest source that I have out of all my sources I used for this project, this is from the 1980s. So I verified this information with interviews to make sure that it is still currently happening and up to date, and it is. And he talked about using talking books, being moved to a sensorily disabled unit. And again, that's touched more in the policy part of my paper, which is in the link below. Also, though the unit had braillers, opticons, and various other modern technology, the inmates had no directions on how to use them. So what other services and accommodations are they missing? Because the prior slide definitely talks about one service that is certainly missing. So this one has a question mark after it, protecting people with visual impairments from being maced. I will explain later on why there's a question mark there. Making sure that the medical professionals are properly treating people with visual impairments and protecting people with visual impairments from abuse. Now I'll talk about each one individually. So let's start off with the first one. So according to the Vision Eye Institute, while many governments approve the use of pepper spray by police or military groups, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that it can cause considerable harm, especially to the eyes. So the epithelial layer of the cornea is disrupted by pepper spray. So people with impaired corneal integrity, such as diabetes, dry eye, or recurrent corneal erosion, are particularly susceptible to these effects compared to those with good eye health. And it says repeated exposure can certainly cause permanent damage to the cornea. I did an interview with an ex-inmate who had been incarcerated at multiple different facilities, and he explained, I was sprayed with pepper spray about 3 times a month. They don't exempt anyone from pepper spray. They would even spray the people that had a glass eye. So this brings up the question, should a person with a visual impairment be exempt from being maced? Should they be exempt from being maced because they might have stronger effects on their eyes than a person without a visual impairment? And also, due to the issue of not wanting to risk any further damage to their eyes since they already have a visual impairment. So this is definitely something up for debate. So now let's talk about making sure that the medical professionals are properly treating people with visual impairments. So again, this is a news article for information due to the lack of information there is about this topic. This talks about how a Vermont inmate was denied treatment for failing eyesight, and the article says a Vermont inmate imprisoned in Pennsylvania says he has been denied treatment for failing eyesight and may go blind as a result. And I did interviews with inmates, and it's about how they address medical care and vision. And in the phone interview with an inmate from Salt Lake County Metro Jail, he said, on the way from the courthouse to the jail van got into an accident. I was in the hospital and in a neck brace. I am now extremely sensitive to light. I have pounding migraines that hurt my eyeball from the lights. They won't let me see an eye doctor. I've been doing grievances. And then an interview with an ex-inmate from multiple different incarceration facilities said for the inmates with vision problems, they would give them glasses that don't even help. Anything to do with vision or health, they don't care about. So it's very interesting to see what their view is on how the jails and prisons view eye care and health. Okay, so now let's talk about protecting people with visual impairments from abuse. So this is a news article that talks about a case where one sergeant stuck his hands through the bars of my cell and hit me on the head and said, "What are you going to do, blind man?" and then threatens to beat him up with very profane language. The news article also says, according to McGivern, the blind prisoners worry about bugs and spit in their food. They find their hygiene products confiscated with no explanation. Their canes are broken and hands get stuck when the guards don't announce that doors are sliding open and shut. One man told McGivern that the correctional officers don't understand human dignity. So now let's talk about services for visual impairment awareness in jails and prisons. So there are some services for visual impairment awareness, such as National Prison Braille Network and Prison Puppies. Let's first talk about National Prison Braille Network. So this is through the American Printing House for the Blind, and inmates in general are taught Braille so they can braille books and menus and other items. And the potential impact of this service on inmates with visual impairments is that it might help reduce abuse from other inmates due to spreading awareness and education about what visual impairment is. It's important to remember that some inmates with visual impairments are in the general unit, so it's really important to have this awareness and to have general inmates have a positive association and awareness about visual impairment to help reduce the abuse. So also Prison Puppies is a similar concept. This is an organization where inmates, this is inmates in general, help raise guide dogs. And Melissa Spooner, who is an LVT, she coordinates Prison Puppies, and it's the same impact as the National Prison Braille Network of just helping reduce abuse from other inmates due to spreading awareness and education about visual impairment. If someone is helping to raise a guide dog, that's a very positive, powerful experience. So that will help them have a positive association with visual impairment and hopefully then be less likely to abuse an inmate with a visual impairment. So in terms of service ideas, one is a pen pal service idea and the other one is an educational service idea. So let's first talk about the pen pal service idea. So there are websites for connecting people to be pen pals with inmates, and there are not any websites for connecting people to write in Braille to inmates that are blind, and it's all about equal access. So currently, there are services such as Canadian Inmates Connect and writeaprisoner.com to connect people to just write standard letters to inmates that are incarcerated, and there's nothing for writing in Braille for inmates that are incarcerated that use Braille. And we want equal access, so that would be a service to implement. And an educational service idea is to educate female inmates about the importance of proper maternal care, and this can help avoid babies acquiring a visual issue that is preventable. So for example, a mother abusing drugs and alcohol while pregnant may contribute to the child acquiring a visual impairment. Also, educating inmates about how trauma can cause eye issues is also important since the overwhelming majority of women in prison are survivors of domestic violence. So this information can help women in domestic violence situations seek help. And also the information about how trauma can cause visual issues may also be important information for the male population as well, due to the violence and abuse reported in the population, and they could also possibly benefit from the maternal care information as well. Thank you very much. Here are the sources.